Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey way back in time, all the way to the Middle Ages, a period so steeped in myth and legend that it can feel more like a fantasy novel than actual history. But don't worry, we're not here to slay dragons or rescue damsels, we're here to sift through the dusty archives and see what's what. I want you to close your eyes, if you feel comfortable doing so, and picture yourself in a vast, dark, medieval hall. The air is cool and a little damp, and the only light comes from the flickering flames of a huge fireplace. Outside, the wind howls like a restless ghost, and the rain patters against the glassless window openings. You can almost feel the rough texture of the wool tunic on your skin and the faint, earthy smell of straw on the floor. Don't get too cozy, though the reality of this era is that you probably wouldn't survive your first winter. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you in the comments. It's always so cool to see how far these little history trips go. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now, let's start with a classic. You've seen the movies, you've read the books, and you've probably even seen the statues. A fierce Viking warrior, helmeted and ready for battle, with two large, menacing horns jutting out from the sides. It's the quintessential image of a Viking, right? A mainstream historical fact that's just plain wrong. Historians still argue whether the helmet was even a common piece of Viking battle gear. But what they don't debate is the horns. They weren't a thing. Not in battle. Not for ceremony. Not ever. The whole horned helmet idea comes from the 19th century. Believe it or not, a Swedish artist named Gustav Malmström illustrated a series of operas by Richard Wagner, and he was the one who added the horns for dramatic effect. The image just stuck, kind of like a catchy song you can't get out of your head. It became so popular that it completely overshadowed reality. Think about it. Can you imagine trying to fight with horns on your head? You'd be more of a walking coat rack than a warrior, getting tangled on every branch and low-hanging sign. Just a little something to tickle the old brain. The quirky tidbit here is that this one artist's creative license, a single decision for an opera, completely changed how we see an entire civilization. It's a powerful testament to the influence of popular culture. The Vikings themselves were actually pretty pragmatic. They needed helmets that would protect them, not make them an easy target. The helmets they did wear were typically conical or dome-shaped, and they were often made of iron, simple, functional, and horn-free. It's a shame. I know. It's so much more fun to imagine a whole army of Vikings looking like something out of a fantasy football league. So, the next time you see that image, remember you're looking at a product of a later era's imagination, not a genuine piece of history. The real Vikings were plenty intimidating without the extra accessories. They didn't need horns to inspire fear. Their longships and reputation for raiding did a pretty good job of that all on their own. As you shuffle your feet, feeling the rough texture of the floor beneath you. Let's move on to another one of those historical myths that's become a staple of pop culture. The kind of thing you see in every haunted castle documentary. You probably know the one I'm talking about, the Iron Maiden. This is a macabre, upright, coffin-like contraption, studded on the inside with sharp spikes. The idea is that a person would be placed inside, the doors would slowly close, and they would be impaled, but not immediately. So their torment would be prolonged. Sounds terrifying, right? A perfect example of brutal medieval justice. But here's the quirky, slightly less terrifying truth. The Iron Maiden is a total fabrication, a piece of lurid fiction invented in the 18th century. There is no evidence, not a single written account, not a single sketch, and certainly not a single archaeological find of an Iron Maiden being used for torture in the Middle Ages. The most famous Iron Maiden, the one in Nuremberg, Germany, was a 19th century construction built for museum exhibition and tourism. It was designed to look like a medieval torture device, tapping into the romanticized and often misunderstood notion of a barbaric past. Think of it as the historical equivalent of a scary movie prop. The mainstream historical fact is that while the Middle Ages certainly had its share of brutal punishments, they were generally much more straightforward and, in a twisted way, efficient. You had your public hangings, your floggings, and various forms of mutilation, but none of the elaborate, slow torture devices that later generations would invent. Historians still argue whether the invention of these fictional devices was a way to make the present seem more enlightened, or simply to sell more books and museum tickets. But either way, they are not part of genuine medieval history. So, when you picture the grim dungeons of a medieval castle, you can erase the mental image of a screaming victim trapped in a spiky box. The reality was a lot less theatrical and, in a way, even more mundane in its cruelty. You're more likely to find a cold, damp cell with maybe a pair of rusty shackles on the wall, not some complex torture machine. The truth of the past is often far more boring and, frankly, more plausible than the myths we create to fill the gaps. The simple and brutal punishments were enough. They didn't need Hollywood theatrics to get their point across. It just goes to show you that sometimes a good story is too good to be ruined by the facts. It's a bit like finding out that your favorite superhero doesn't actually fly. They just have a really fast jetpack. A little bit of the magic is lost. But the underlying story is still compelling, as you find yourself leaning back, a little bit more relaxed now that you know you won't be put inside a spiky coffin. Let's turn our attention to one of the most persistent and, frankly, most absurd myths of the Middle Ages, the chastity belt. The image is vivid, isn't it? A grim-faced knight riding off to the Crusades or some distant battle, locking his poor, long-suffering wife into a heavy, uncomfortable iron contraption to ensure her fidelity. It sounds so perfectly medieval, so full of possessive cruelty and Gothic romance, and it's exactly that kind of appeal that makes it so hard to shake. But here's the quirky tidbit. The chastity belt is, with near certainty, a complete fabrication from the Victorian era. No authentic, medieval chastity belt has ever been found in a historical context, nor are there any reliable descriptions of their use from the period itself. The few examples that exist in museums today were, for the most part, created in the 19th century. They were designed and sold as novelty items, often for tourists, or as curiosities meant to titillate and shock a public obsessed with the barbarism of the past. It's a bit like a modern-day Halloween prop that someone tries to pass off as a genuine artifact from centuries ago. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval society had other, far more effective ways of ensuring fidelity and controlling women, primarily through social pressure, religious injunctions, and legal frameworks that made adultery a serious offense. The idea of a physical, more wearable lock was simply not part of their cultural or technological reality. Historians still argue whether the myth of the chastity belt was purely a product of Victorian-era prudishness and fetishism, or if it was also a way to create a more stark contrast between the enlightened present and the supposedly brutish past. Either way, the truth is a lot less dramatic. The relationships between men and women in the Middle Ages were complex, governed by laws of inheritance, arranged marriages, and the powerful influence of the church. They didn't need a clunky piece of metal to keep people in line, and honestly, can you imagine trying to get around in one of those things? You'd be clanking and creaking with every step, making it less of a discreet restraint and more of a walking advertisement. Not exactly practical for, daily life. It's just a funny reminder that sometimes the weirdest myths are the most modern ones. Born from a desire to make the past more sensational than it really was. Now, as you settle deeper into your pillow, let's brush aside another iconic, albeit tarnished, image of the medieval world. The knight in shining armor. You know the guy, perfectly polished from head to toe, with a gleaming breastplate and a spotless helmet. He's the star of every fairy tale and the face of chivalry. But let's be real for a second. The idea of a perpetually pristine knight is more romantic fantasy than historical fact. The mainstream historical fact is that armor was incredibly difficult to maintain. It was heavy, and it was constantly getting scuffed, dented, and scratched in battle, in training, and just from daily use. Think of it like trying to keep a car perfectly clean and scratch-free while driving it through a demolition derby. It's just not going to happen. The quirky tidbit here is that while some armor might have been polished for special occasions, like a tournament or a parade, the everyday armor of a fighting knight would have been anything but. It would have been a practical, functional piece of equipment, not a fashion statement. It would have had dents from maces, scratches from swords, and the dark patina of age and use. And remember, these guys didn't have a handy can of metal polish in their saddlebags. Keeping that armor gleaming would have been a full-time job, and they had more pressing things to do, like, not getting stabbed. Historians still argue whether the romanticized image of the knight in shining armor was a deliberate invention of later periods to make the past seem more heroic, or if it was simply a byproduct of artistic license. But whatever the reason, it's a far cry from the reality. The real knights were soldiers. Their armor was their protection, not their jewelry. And the truest measure of a knight wasn't how shiny his armor was, but how well he could use it. It's a humbling thought, isn't it? That our heroes are often a lot messier and more worn than we imagine them to be. Just like the best stories aren't always perfect and neat. The best history isn't always shiny. A little bit of grit and rust often tells a better story. All right, let's keep going, sinking deeper into the soft, historical murk. Now, let's talk about a concept that probably came up in a high school history class or two, the Great Chain of Being. This was often presented as a rigid, hierarchical structure that supposedly governed medieval society, from God at the very top, down through the angels, monarchs, nobles, and finally, all the way down to the lowliest peasant, or maybe even a worm. You've probably seen a diagram of it, a neat little pyramid with everyone in their fixed, appointed place. It sounds so tidy and so, well, medieval. The mainstream historical fact is that while medieval people certainly believed in a divinely ordained order and a hierarchical society, the Great Chain of Being, as a single, formal, and widely recognized concept, is more of a later philosophical construct. The quirky tidbit here is that this idea gained far more traction and was more explicitly defined during the Renaissance and early modern period, not the Middle Ages. The concept was a way for later thinkers to try and make sense of and rationalize the complex social structures of the past. It's a bit like us creating a flowchart for a medieval manor house. We're imposing a modern, logical framework onto a reality that was a lot messier. A medieval person, if you asked them, would likely have believed in a divinely ordered world, but they wouldn't have had a neat diagram to show you. Their reality was much more fluid and filled with exceptions. For example, a particularly talented peasant might become a trusted advisor, or a merchant might amass enough wealth to marry into the nobility. Historians still argue whether this later philosophical construct truly reflected medieval thought, or if it was a convenient myth to make sense of a chaotic and often unpredictable world. So, while the basic idea of a strict social hierarchy was very much a part of medieval life, the specific, formalized concept of the Great Chain of Being is, in many ways, an intellectual myth. It's an oversimplification that makes a complex reality seem a little too simple and a little too neat. Life back then was a mix of hard rules and surprising exceptions. It's a good reminder that history isn't just a series of clean, boxed-up concepts. It's a living, breathing, and often very contradictory thing. Let's continue our peaceful drift back in time, away from the tidy myths and into the messy reality. A lot of people have this image of medieval folk as being, well, short, like everyone was a hobbit, basically. You've probably heard it before, that the average man was maybe 5'3" and a woman even shorter. And while it's a mainstream historical fact that medieval people were generally not as tall as modern humans, the idea that they were all drastically short is a bit of an exaggeration. For example, evidence from skeletons suggests that the average height for a man in England during the late Middle Ages was about 5 feet 6 inches, while women were around 5 feet 2 inches. That's certainly shorter than today's average, but it's not the tiny, stunted people of popular imagination. Here's a quirky tidbit. Height was often a marker of social class. The skeletons of nobles and the wealthy often show that they were taller than peasants. Why? Well, it all came down to diet. The nobility had access to a much more consistent and protein-rich diet, while peasants' meals were often based on grains like rye and barley, which, while nourishing, didn't provide the same nutritional punch, especially in times of scarcity. So, if you were a peasant, you were more likely to be on the shorter side due to chronic malnutrition or even just a less than ideal diet during your growing years. It's a bit like modern-day athletes who have specialized diets to grow and maintain their physique. It's a matter of resources. Historians still argue whether this height difference was a direct result of nutrition alone, or if other factors like disease and sanitation also played a significant role. It's hard to untangle all the variables, but the simple truth is, you'd find a lot of people in the Middle Ages who were the same height as you are now, particularly among the upper classes. So, the next time you see a movie where all the peasants are tiny and the knights are towering, just know that it's probably a bit of an artistic liberty. The reality was a lot more diverse, and a person's height was often a very visible sign of their place in society. It just goes to show that even something as simple as how tall someone is can tell a complex story about their life. Okay, let's keep the gentle flow of our historical journey going. It's a common belief that almost no one could read or write in the Middle Ages, that widespread illiteracy was the norm for pretty much everyone outside of a few monks and a handful of nobles. The images of a world where knowledge was almost exclusively passed down through spoken word or simple pictures, and while it is a mainstream historical fact that literacy rates were much lower than they are today, the idea of universal illiteracy is a significant myth. Literacy was certainly limited, but it wasn't non-existent, especially within specific groups and for particular purposes. Here's a quirky tidbit. While most peasants were illiterate, literacy was not confined solely to the clergy. Merchants, for example, had a very practical need to read and write. They had to keep ledgers, write contracts, and correspond with business partners. You couldn't manage a large-scale trade operation just by memory and a firm handshake. It just wouldn't work. So, in the bustling urban centres of medieval Europe, there would have been a surprising number of people who, at the very least, had a basic level of literacy for commercial purposes. It's a bit like learning to read a recipe but not being able to write a novel. It's functional literacy, and it was a lot more common than we think. Historians still argue whether the decline in literacy after the fall of the Roman Empire was as steep as once thought, and they are constantly uncovering new evidence of people who could read and write outside of the traditional spheres of power. For example, letters and legal documents from the period show a wider range of people, including some women, signing their names or at least having the ability to understand a written document. So, while you're picturing a medieval village, remember that a lot of people had to rely on a few literate folks to read out decrees and public notices. But it wasn't a world without any written communication at all. It was a world where literacy was a valuable and often very specific skill, not a universal expectation. As you feel the last vestiges of daylight fade from your room, let's push on to another one of the biggest, most widely accepted historical myths of all time, the idea of the Dark Ages. You've heard the term, right? It conjures up a world of intellectual stagnation, where knowledge was lost, art ceased to exist, and progress basically ground to a halt after the fall of the Roman Empire. It's an easy and tidy way to think about a long period of history, but the mainstream historical fact is that this period, roughly from the 5th to the 10th century, was far from dark. The term was actually coined by a 14th century Italian scholar named Petrarch, who was more interested in the literary achievements of ancient Rome and Greece than he was in his own immediate past. He saw his own time as a decline from the classical era, and the name just stuck. Here's a quirky tidbit to light up that supposedly dark period. This was a time of immense innovation. The stirrup, which revolutionized cavalry warfare, became widespread during this era. Monks were meticulously copying and preserving classical texts, without which a huge amount of ancient knowledge would have been lost forever. And let's not forget the incredible artistic achievements, like the intricate metalwork of the Anglo-Saxons, or the beautiful illuminated manuscripts created in Ireland and England. The Book of Kells, for example, is a testament to the incredible skill and artistry of this time. It's a bit like calling a quiet and thoughtful person boring just because they aren't loud and flashy. The Dark Ages were a time of cultural and intellectual shifts, not a total shutdown. Historians still argue whether the term Dark Ages should be abandoned entirely in favour of something more neutral like the early Middle Ages. It's a point of contention because the old name carries so much baggage and misunderstanding. But the truth remains the same. This was a period of transition, not of total intellectual night. The foundations for later medieval innovations in architecture, technology, and governance were all laid during this supposedly dark time. So, the next time you hear someone use the phrase, you can nod knowingly and think about all the quiet, brilliant work that was actually happening behind the scenes. It's a gentle reminder that some of the most important parts of history don't always come with a grand, dramatic headline. As we continue our slow and steady descent into the past, let's tackle one of the most enduring and almost comically wrong historical myths, the idea that everyone in the Middle Ages believed the Earth was flat. It's the kind of myth that's been drilled into us since we were kids, that Christopher Columbus was a brave visionary who had to convince a bunch of ignorant, flat earth-believing monarchs that he wouldn't sail right off the edge of the world. The mainstream historical fact is that this is a total fabrication, largely created by 19th century writers who wanted to make the past look more ignorant and superstitious, and the present more enlightened and scientific. The quirky tidbit here is that educated people, from the ancient Greeks all the way through the Middle Ages, were well aware that the Earth was a sphere. The ancient Greeks, for example, had already figured it out using clever observations. They noticed that as a ship sailed away, the hull would disappear first, followed by the mast, which is exactly what would happen on a curved surface. They also noted the changing positions of constellations as you travelled north or south. They even managed to calculate the Earth's circumference with impressive accuracy. This knowledge didn't just disappear with the fall of the Roman Empire. Scholars in the Middle Ages, like the Venerable Bede and later Thomas Aquinas, wrote about a spherical Earth. It was simply not a point of contention for them. Historians still argue about why this particular myth took such deep root in our collective consciousness. Was it to paint Columbus as an even greater hero? Was it to serve as a cautionary tale against religious dogmatism? Whatever the reason. The idea that a medieval person thought they would fall off the edge of the world is as silly as you and I believing the moon is made of cheese. It just wasn't a thing. In fact, medieval maps and globes from the period clearly depict a spherical world. The real debate wasn't about the shape of the Earth, but rather the size of the ocean and whether a ship could carry enough provisions to cross it. So, you can close your eyes and feel safe in the knowledge that no one was worried about falling off the edge. That's a myth. And now you know better. Let's keep the historical tide rolling. You've probably heard of medieval justice being a bit, shall we say, dramatic. And nothing sounds more dramatic and more prone to divine intervention than a trial by ordeal. The image is vivid, a person's guilt or innocence determined by whether they could hold a red-hot iron without getting burned, or if they sank or floated when thrown into a body of water. The mainstream historical fact is that while these trials were a real thing, their use was not as common or widespread as popular myth would have you believe. They were often used as a last resort when there was a lack of evidence, and they were, in a quirky tidbit, often preceded by a more conventional investigation. It wasn't just a free-for-all where everyone with a slight dispute had to walk on hot coals. The process of a trial by ordeal was also highly ritualized and controlled by the church, which gave it a certain air of legitimacy, at least to the people of the time. You weren't just tossed into a pond. A priest would bless the water, and there would be very specific prayers and procedures. It was more of a solemn, theatrical event than a spontaneous act of brutality. Historians still argue about the true purpose of these trials. Were they simply a way to force a confession, or was there a genuine belief that God would intervene and reveal the truth? It's hard to say for sure, but we do know that a lot of people were found innocent. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? Just kidding. A little historical humor for you. But seriously, the results weren't always what you'd expect. A person might have had a less severe burn than expected, or some people were just so scared that they confessed anyway. In the end, the church itself began to sour on the idea, and by 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council essentially banned clergy from participating in them, which led to their rapid decline. So, while you're picturing the rough, brutal justice of the Middle Ages, remember that even back then, people were looking for better, more reliable ways to determine guilt and innocence. The trial by ordeal was a fascinating but ultimately temporary chapter in legal history, not a defining characteristic of the entire era. It shows us that even in the past, ideas of justice were evolving. Slowly but surely, as you continue to relax, let's consider another dramatic staple of medieval movies and books, the notion of widespread public executions. We've all seen the scene, a crowded town square, a makeshift gallows, and a huge audience of cheering or jeering onlookers. It's an image that has been burned into our collective consciousness, a symbol of brutal medieval justice and a public spectacle. The mainstream historical fact is that while public executions certainly occurred, they were not the daily or weekly spectacles we often imagine. Their use was often reserved for high-profile crimes like treason or heresy, and they were often used to send a specific political message. Here's a quirky tidbit. Many executions, particularly for less serious crimes, were carried out privately or with very little fanfare. For example, a man convicted of a simple theft might be hanged on a private gallows on a lord's estate. away from prying eyes. It wasn't always a town-wide event. In fact, a public execution was a huge undertaking. You had to get the condemned to the site, set up the gallows, and a whole host of other logistical headaches. It was a production, and it wasn't something a village would organize for just any crime. The whole point was to be a deterrent, a warning to others, but if you had too many of them, they would lose their impact and become just another part of the background. Historians still argue whether the public nature of these events was more about maintaining social control or about fulfilling a community's need for a form of communal retribution. So, while you might picture a medieval town square with a permanent gallows in the center, the reality was often a bit different. The gallows might be erected just for a specific event, a grim centerpiece to a grim occasion. Public executions were less of a routine and more of an exception. They were used to send a clear message, but they weren't the constant, bloody entertainment that later generations often portrayed them to be. It's a good reminder that history, especially the darker parts, is rarely as simple and as sensational as we make it out to be. It was a tool of power, not just a bloody show. As you continue to find a cozy spot, let's tiptoe into another popular myth. One that's been fueled by countless stories and movies, the idea that witch hunts were a central feature of the medieval period. When you think of a medieval village, you might picture the local healer being accused of witchcraft, or a woman with a cat being burned at the stake. It's a powerful and disturbing image, but the mainstream historical fact is that the peak of the witch hunts was actually much, much later, in the early modern period, roughly from the late 15th century to the late 18th century. The quirky tidbit here is that while there were some trials for witchcraft in the Middle Ages, they were relatively rare and were often treated more like a form of heresy. The punishments were often less severe, and the idea of a large-scale, systematic hunt for witches wasn't really a thing. The real fear and hysteria that drove the mass witch hunts like those in Salem, Massachusetts, in the late 17th century, or in Germany, came much later. It was fueled by a combination of religious tensions, social upheaval, and the creation of legal and theological frameworks that made it easier to prosecute accused witches. Historians still argue whether the witch hunts were driven more by a fear of the devil or by a fear of social and political outsiders. So, while you might feel a shiver down your spine thinking about the dark superstitions of the past, remember that the most intense and widespread periods of witch hunting happened long after the Middle Ages had officially ended. It's a good reminder that history is not a continuous, linear slide into progress. Sometimes, things get worse before they get better. The medieval period had its own unique fears and superstitions, to be sure, but the great terror of the witch hunts belongs to a later, and in some ways, even more complex era. Let's keep our mental stroll through the past going. Moving on to another one of those myths that just won't die, the idea that medieval people were a bunch of dirty, unwashed individuals who rarely, if ever, bathed. The image is of a person smelling of wood smoke and body odor, walking around in grimy clothes, and while it's true that sanitation in the Middle Ages was very different from what we're used to, the idea that people were universally and constantly filthy is a significant exaggeration. The mainstream historical fact is that personal hygiene was not a completely foreign concept, it was just practiced differently and with varying degrees of regularity. Here's a quirky tidbit: medieval towns and cities often had public bathhouses, which were popular social hubs. People would go there not just to get clean, but also to socialize and relax. They were often privately run and were a common feature in many urban areas, much like a modern-day coffee shop or a local pub. For those who lived in rural areas, people would often bathe in rivers, lakes, or even wooden tubs heated with stones. So while a daily shower wasn't a thing, a weekly or bi-weekly bath was not out of the question for many people. And let's not forget the importance of clean linens. People understood that changing their clothes was a way to feel fresh and clean. Historians still argue whether the decline of public bathing in some parts of Europe during the late Middle Ages was due to the rise of religious asceticism, or if it was more a consequence of the Black Death, which made people wary of crowded public spaces. But whatever the reason, the idea that the entire medieval period was an era of universal filth is simply not accurate. They weren't as clean as we are, and their understanding of germs and disease was non-existent. But they did try. It's a gentle reminder that even in the past, people were more like us than we often give them credit for. They were just trying to be comfortable and clean in a world with different challenges. Let's keep the slow drift going. because it's time to confront another one of those grim and surprisingly inaccurate images we have of medieval life, the idea that everyone was toothless and old before they hit 30. The myth is that a combination of poor diet, lack of dental hygiene, and general hardship meant that people's teeth were falling out left and right. And while it is a mainstream historical fact that dental health was not great by modern standards, the idea of universal toothlessness is a gross exaggeration. People's teeth were often worn down from a gritty diet. Grains ground by hand with stone often left tiny bits of grit in the flour, but that doesn't mean they were all missing. Here's a quirky tidbit. The diet of the average medieval person, particularly peasants, was often low in sugar, which is a major cause of tooth decay today. They didn't have candy, sodas, or processed junk food. So while their teeth might have been worn down and a little stained, they weren't necessarily full of cavities. The wealthy, who had access to more sugary foods like honey and imported sweets, often had worse dental health than their peasant counterparts. It's a classic case of the rich having a worse time, at least in one very specific area. Historians still argue whether the most common dental problem was decay or simply extreme wear and tear from their diet. But what we do know is that a lot of medieval skeletons show a good number of teeth still intact, even in people who lived into their later years. So, the next time you picture a bunch of toothless grannies and grandpas in the Middle Ages, remember that while they might not have had a sparkling Hollywood smile, they were probably getting by just fine. The reality is often a lot less dramatic than the myth. Let's keep the slow drift going, because it's time to confront another one of those persistent myths that's become a staple of pop culture. The idea of constant peasant rebellion. You've probably seen a movie or read a book where a band of angry, pitchfork-wielding peasants is constantly on the verge of revolt. And while it is a mainstream historical fact that peasant uprisings did happen, the idea that they were a constant and universal feature of medieval life is a significant overstatement. The truth is, open rebellion was a rare and incredibly risky business for a peasant. Most of the time, they were more concerned with survival and day-to-day life. Here's a quirky tidbit. A lot of the time, peasant dissatisfaction was expressed in much more subtle and non-violent ways. They might slow down their work, hide a portion of their harvest, or simply refuse to cooperate with a difficult lord. These were forms of everyday resistance that were far more common than a full-blown revolt. It was a safer way to push back without risking their lives. When a full-scale rebellion did happen, it was often the result of a very specific and often unbearable pressure, like a new tax or a devastating famine. It was a last resort, not a constant state of being. Historians still argue whether these rebellions were a sign of a deeply flawed and unjust system, or if they were a testament to the fact that even the most oppressed people would not tolerate an unbearable situation. The reality is that for most of the Middle Ages, peasants had to find a way to make a life work within the system they were born into. They had a lot to lose, and a lot to fear, which is why a full-blown rebellion was a terrifying and desperate undertaking, not a casual pastime. So, while you're picturing a bunch of angry peasants, remember that most of them were probably just trying to get by, quietly and without a pitchfork. Let's keep our journey smooth and gentle, and turn our attention to the fascinating world of medieval social structure. You might have this idea that nobility was a matter of pure lineage, that if you were a noble, your bloodline was pristine and you were set for life. The myth is that it was an unchangeable, rigid system where everyone knew their place based on birth alone. The mainstream historical fact is that this wasn't always the case. The lines of nobility were a lot more fluid than we often think. It wasn't just about who your parents were, it was also about power, wealth, and strategic alliances. Here's a quirky tidbit. Social mobility, while limited, did exist. For example, a successful merchant might amass a huge fortune and use it to buy land, which was the ultimate source of power and status in the Middle Ages. They might then arrange for their children to marry into a lower-level noble family, a transaction that benefited both parties. The merchant's family gets status, and the noble family gets much-needed cash. Over a generation or two, that merchant's family could become part of the nobility, and their origins would be forgotten. It was a slow process, but it happened. And while the idea of a peasant becoming a knight is rare, it was not unheard of, especially in times of war where a brave soldier could be rewarded with land and a title. Historians still argue whether these examples of social mobility were the exception or if they were a more common part of the medieval landscape. But what we do know is that the idea of a pure, unbroken noble bloodline is a romanticized myth. The reality was that titles and lands changed hands, bloodlines were mixed through strategic marriages, and power was constantly being renegotiated. So, the next time you see a movie where everyone is born into a fixed role, remember that the reality was a lot more complex and, in some ways, a lot more human. Let's keep the slow drift going, because it's time to take on another one of the most romanticized figures of the Middle Ages, the heroic knight. You have this picture of a chivalrous, honorable warrior, always ready to save the day, rescue a maiden, or fight for what's right. It's an image that's been built up over centuries of stories and poems. The mainstream historical fact is that while the ideals of chivalry did exist, knights were far from the perfect heroes of legend. They were, in many ways, just medieval mercenaries and landowners who were often just as brutal and pragmatic as anyone else. Here's a quirky tidbit. A knight's primary duty wasn't always to the damsel in distress, it was to his lord, and that often involved things like collecting taxes, enforcing the law, often violently, and raiding the lands of rival lords. They were a professional warrior class, and their actions were often driven by the need for land, wealth, and power. The stories of chivalry and honor were, in many ways, a way to make their often brutal and messy lives seem more noble. And let's be honest, you can't have a good story about a knight without a little bit of drama and honor. Historians still argue whether the code of chivalry was a genuine ethical framework that knights strove to live up to, or if it was simply a form of propaganda used by the elite to justify their position in society. The reality is probably a mix of both. Some knights were probably genuinely honorable, while others were just ruthless thugs with a good public relations team. So, the next time you picture a shining, perfect knight, remember that the real ones were a lot more human, a lot more flawed, and a lot more concerned with the practicalities of survival and power than with a pure, heroic ideal. As you continue to find that perfect, sleepy spot, let's address another common myth that paints the Middle Ages as a constant, unrelenting series of battles and sieges. The idea of constant warfare is a staple of fantasy novels and historical films. But the mainstream historical fact is that while conflicts were frequent, periods of peace and stability were far more common than a state of continuous, all-out war. Life had to go on, crops had to be planted and harvested, goods had to be traded, and babies had to be born. A society that was in a constant state of battle would simply collapse. Here's a quirky tidbit. Warfare in the Middle Ages was often a seasonal affair. It would generally begin in the spring, after the muddy roads had dried out, and would end in the late fall, when the weather turned cold and it became difficult to campaign. It was an agricultural society, and the rhythm of war was often dictated by the rhythm of farming. It was difficult to keep a large army together through the winter, and lords often had to let their men go home for the harvest. This meant that even in a period of conflict, there were long stretches of time where nothing much was happening. Historians still argue whether the scale of these conflicts was as great as some sources suggest, or if they were often localized affairs that had little impact on the average person's life. So, while you might picture a world of endless battles, remember that the reality was a lot more complex and, in many ways, a lot more boring. The average peasant was more concerned with the weather and the price of grain than with a distant war. It's a gentle reminder that history is not just a highlight reel of dramatic events. It's a lot of quiet, day-to-day living, even in times of conflict. Let's keep our historical journey on a smooth, sleepy course. It's a common belief, fueled by our love of dramatic stories, that medieval monarchs were all-powerful rulers who held absolute sway over their kingdoms. You picture a king or queen whose every command was law, whose whims determined the fate of their subjects. But the mainstream historical fact is that a monarch's power was far from absolute. It was a complex dance of power sharing and negotiation, and they faced significant checks on their authority from a variety of sources. Here's a quirky tidbit. One of the most powerful forces a monarch had to contend with was the nobility. A king or queen might technically be the head of the country, but they were often reliant on the loyalty and military support of their powerful lords and barons. These nobles controlled vast tracts of land and had their own private armies. If a monarch wanted to go to war or raise taxes, they often had to get the nobles on board first. And that often meant making compromises. It was a constant balancing act between asserting royal authority and not alienating the very people you needed to rule. Historians still argue whether the power struggles between monarchs and their nobles were a sign of a dysfunctional political system, or if they were an early form of a constitutional check on power. The reality is that a medieval king's power was often more symbolic than it was absolute. You remember the Magna Carta, right? It was a document that English barons forced their king to sign, limiting his power and establishing that even a monarch was subject to the law. It's a gentle reminder that even in the past, a ruler couldn't always do whatever they wanted. Now, as you find yourself nestled in the dark, let's turn our attention to another figure who we often think of as all-powerful, the Pope. The myth is that the Pope's word was law, a kind of divine final authority that no one, not even a king, would dare to challenge. The image is of a single, unchallengeable head of the church, with a flock of obedient followers. But the mainstream historical fact is that the Pope's authority was often challenged, not just by secular rulers, but also by internal church conflicts. The relationship between the spiritual and temporal powers was a constant source of tension and negotiation. Here's a quirky tidbit. One of the most famous examples of a pope's power being challenged was the conflict between Pope Gregory VII and Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. Gregory excommunicated Henry, but Henry responded by marching on Rome and forcing Gregory into exile. It was a messy, brutal power struggle that showed just how limited a pope's power could be when it came up against a powerful and determined secular ruler. It wasn't always a case of one side bowing to the other. It was often a war of attrition. Historians still argue whether these conflicts were a sign of the church's declining influence, or if they were a natural consequence of the church trying to centralize its power. So, while you might think of the Pope as a kind of medieval superhero, with his power being absolute, remember that the reality was a lot more complex and, in some ways, a lot more human. The Pope had to deal with the same political headaches as a king: rivalries, alliances, and the constant threat of a powerful enemy. It's a good reminder that even the most powerful people in history were often just trying to get by, one political problem at a time. As you continue to find your perfect spot, let's turn our attention to one of the most misunderstood concepts of the Middle Ages: feudalism. You've probably seen it depicted as a rigid, static pyramid with the king at the top and peasants at the very bottom, with no way to move up. The mainstream historical fact is that while feudalism was certainly a hierarchical system, it was far more complex and flexible than this simple pyramid model suggests. It was a fluid network of relationships, not a static, unchangeable structure. Here's a quirky tidbit. The feudal relationship was based on an exchange of land for service, a contract of sorts between a lord and a vassal. This relationship was often personal and could be renegotiated. A lord might have multiple vassals, and a vassal might owe service to more than one lord. It wasn't always a clean, one-to-one relationship. In some cases, a vassal might become so powerful that they could challenge their own lord, leading to all sorts of messy conflicts and alliances. It was a system that was constantly in flux, not a rigid, unchangeable law. Historians still argue whether the term feudalism is even an accurate way to describe the system. Some argue that it's a later 17th century term that was imposed on the Middle Ages to make a messy reality seem more organized. The reality was that a king's power was often a lot less than his title suggests, and a powerful duke or count could be an independent ruler in all but name. It was a system that was often messy and contradictory, not a neat, tidy pyramid. It's a gentle reminder that history is rarely as clean and simple as we try to make it. Now, as you find yourself nestled in the dark, let's turn our attention to one of the most beloved and terrifying creatures of medieval folklore: dragons. You've probably seen them everywhere. From movies to video games, the images of a fearsome, fire-breathing beast that a heroic knight must slay to save a kingdom. The mainstream historical fact is that while the belief in dragons was widespread, it was far more symbolic or allegorical than a claim of literal, widespread sightings. No one was truly convinced a massive lizard with wings was flying over their village. Here's a quirky tidbit. The dragon was often seen as a symbol of evil or a representation of sin. Slaying a dragon, in this context, wasn't just a physical act, it was a metaphorical one. It represented the triumph of good over evil. The story of St. George and the dragon, for example, wasn't necessarily meant to be taken as a literal account of a knight fighting a scaly beast. It was a powerful religious and moral story that conveyed a deeper truth about faith and courage. And remember that whole chivalrous knight thing we debunked earlier? Well, this is just another layer to that. The dragon was often used in art and literature as a symbol of the very thing a knight was supposed to fight against. Historians still argue whether the belief in dragons was a misunderstanding of fossils or other strange animal remains, or if it was just a cultural archetype that was so powerful it became a reality in people's minds. Whatever the reason, you can close your eyes and feel safe in the knowledge that no one was worried about a fire-breathing dragon attacking their castle. That's a myth, and now you know better as you continue to find your perfect spot. Let's turn our attention to one of the most beloved and equally misunderstood creatures of medieval folklore, unicorns. The image is vivid, a graceful, horse-like creature with a single, spiraling horn on its forehead. The myth is that these were purely creatures of fantasy, born from a medieval imagination. The mainstream historical fact is that in the Middle Ages, the unicorn was widely believed to be a real animal, a creature of immense power and purity, a symbol of Christ and virtue. They weren't just a fantasy, they were part of a very real and very strange medieval bestiary. Here's a quirky tidbit. The belief in the unicorn was likely born from travelers' accounts and the discovery of narwhal tusks. For centuries, these long, spiraling tusks would wash up on beaches or be brought back by sailors, and they were often sold for a huge price as unicorn horns or alicorns. They were believed to have magical properties, to be able to purify water and to be a universal antidote to poison. It was a perfect marketing scheme. Really, someone finds a weird bone, calls it a unicorn horn, and sells it to a king who is terrified of being poisoned. Everyone wins. Except for the narwhal. Historians still argue whether the belief in unicorns was a simple case of mistaken identity, or if the myth of the unicorn was so powerful that it created a demand for the narwhal's horn. So, while you might think of a unicorn as just a fairy tale creature for a medieval person, it was a very real, if very rare, animal. It was a creature of immense symbolic power, and the horn was a highly sought-after and valuable commodity. It's a gentle reminder that sometimes the line between myth and reality is a lot blurrier than we think, and that a narwhal's tusk could be the source of 1,000 legends. Let's keep our gentle drift going and turn our attention to one of the most intriguing and often misunderstood parts of medieval exploration and mapping, the belief in monstrous races. You've probably seen it on old maps or in medieval texts. Descriptions of people with no heads, dog-headed men, or people with one giant foot. The myth is that medieval people truly believed these monstrous humanoids were just around the next bend. The mainstream historical fact is that these descriptions were often a result of misunderstanding foreign cultures, and they weren't necessarily seen as monsters in the way we think of them. Here's a quirky tidbit. A lot of these accounts came from ancient Roman and Greek texts, and medieval scholars simply copied and recopied them, assuming they were accurate descriptions of people living in far-off lands. Think about it. If you had never seen a person from a different continent, and you were given a description from someone who had no idea what they were talking about, you might believe it too. The dog-headed men, for example, might have been a misunderstanding of a foreign group who wore animal skins or had a different style of dress. The one-footed people might have been a traveller's exaggeration of a culture that used a certain kind of shade or umbrella. Historians still argue whether these descriptions were a form of racial prejudice, a way to make foreign cultures seem less human, or if they were simply a product of ignorance and a lack of reliable information. The reality is that the Middle Ages was a time of expanding horizons, but reliable information was hard to come by. So, while you might picture a medieval person being terrified of a monster on the other side of the world, remember that they were often just trying to make sense of a world that was getting bigger and bigger, one strange traveller's tale at a time. It's a gentle reminder that even today, we can get things wrong when we don't have all the facts. Let's keep our sleepy journey going, and turn our attention to one of the most fundamental aspects of medieval life, religion. We often have this idea of universal religious fervour, that every single person in the Middle Ages was a devout, unquestioning follower of the Church, with their entire life revolving around worship and piety. The myth is that there was no dissent, no doubt, and no variation in belief. The mainstream historical fact is that while religion was central to life, personal beliefs and practices varied widely. Here's a quirky tidbit. While everyone went to church, People's personal relationship with their faith was often a lot more complex and nuanced than we give them credit for. They had their own superstitions, their own traditions, and their own doubts. For example, some people would mix Christian prayers with older, pre-Christian folk beliefs about nature and spirits. It wasn't a neat, clean, one-size-fits-all kind of faith. It was a messy, human, and often contradictory mix of beliefs. And remember, the church had to work very hard to enforce its doctrines. If everyone was a perfect, unquestioning believer, they wouldn't have had to put so much effort into stamping out heresy. Historians still argue whether the church's power came from the genuine piety of the masses, or if it was more a result of its political and economic power. The reality is that for a lot of people, religion was a very practical thing. You prayed for a good harvest, you prayed for your health, and you prayed for your family. It wasn't always a grand, intellectual journey. It was often a quiet, personal, and very human act of hope and fear. It's a good reminder that even in the past, people were more complex than our simple historical myths allow. Let's keep the historical tide rolling. You've probably heard of the Crusader, a figure often romanticized as a devout, pious warrior, driven solely by faith to liberate the Holy Land from a different religious group. The myth is that these were purely religious wars, fought by perfect heroes of the faith. The mainstream historical fact is that while religious fervor was certainly a powerful motivator, Crusaders were not always driven by piety alone. Many were motivated by land, wealth, and adventure. Here's a quirky tidbit. A lot of the younger sons of noble families, who had no hope of inheriting their family's land, saw the Crusades as a perfect opportunity to carve out a new kingdom for themselves in the East. For them, it wasn't just about God, it was about getting rich and becoming powerful. It was a perfect storm of opportunity and ambition, and a lot of Crusaders, when they got to the Holy Land, were more interested in sacking cities and plundering riches than they were in freeing the holy places. Historians still argue whether the Crusades were a genuine religious movement or if they were simply a convenient justification for territorial expansion and economic gain. The reality is that for a lot of people, the Crusades were a business trip, a way to make a life for themselves in a new land. It's a good reminder that even in the most religious of times, people were still people, with all their messy, human motivations. They were more complex than our simple historical myths allow. As you continue to find your perfect, sleepy spot, let's turn our attention to one of the most devastating and misunderstood events in human history, the Black Death. We often have this idea that it was some kind of supernatural plague, a punishment from God, or a miasma of evil air. The myth is that it was an unstoppable, unknowable force of nature. The mainstream historical fact is that the Black Death was not a supernatural plague at all. It was caused by a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, which was carried by fleas on rats. Here's a quirky tidbit. While people didn't know about germs, they did have some surprisingly effective ideas about how to deal with the plague. They practiced social distancing, a concept that's very familiar to us now. People would flee infected cities, and some cities would quarantine newcomers. Venice, for example, had a 40-day quarantine for all incoming ships, a practice that gave us the word quarantine itself. They didn't know why it worked, but they knew that keeping people apart seemed to help. Historians still argue whether the plague was a single, massive wave of death, or if it was a series of smaller outbreaks that waxed and waned over a long period of time. The reality is that for a lot of people, the plague was terrifying because it was so fast and so deadly. But it wasn't a punishment from God, it was a biological reality, and a very human one. It's a gentle reminder that even in the past, people were trying to find rational solutions to irrational problems, even if they didn't have the scientific knowledge to understand why those solutions worked. Let's keep the slow drift going, because it's time to confront another one of the most iconic, yet completely wrong historical images, the plague doctor. You've seen the image. A tall and sinister figure in a long black coat, a wide-brimmed hat, and a creepy, beak-like mask. The myth is that these doctors, with their unsettling outfits, were a common sight during the medieval Black Death. The mainstream historical fact is that the iconic plague doctor costume, with its beaked mask, was actually a later invention from the 17th century. Long after the Middle Ages had ended, here's a quirky tidbit: the beak was not just for show. It was a functional part of the costume, designed to be filled with aromatic herbs, flowers, and spices like mint or rose petals. The idea was that the miasma, or bad air, was what caused the plague, and that these strong scents would ward off the disease. They were trying to create a kind of aromatic shield. The long coat and gloves were also part of this early attempt at personal protective equipment, meant to keep the bad air away from the body. It's a bit like a medieval hazmat suit, if you will. Historians still argue whether the invention of this costume was driven more by a genuine, if misguided, attempt at medical protection, or if it was simply a psychological tool to make the doctors seem more authoritative and otherworldly. So, while you might picture a medieval street filled with these ghostly figures, remember that the real doctors of the Black Death were likely just regular physicians, trying their best to treat a disease they didn't understand. The iconic, beak-masked figure belongs to a later era, one that was just as terrified of disease, but a little better at creating a costume for it, as you continue to find your perfect, sleepy spot. Let's turn our attention to one of the most misunderstood parts of medieval life: medieval medicine. We often have this idea of it being completely primitive, based on superstition and bloodletting, with doctors who had no real idea what they were doing. The myth is that it was a time of total ignorance and that no one ever got better. The mainstream historical fact is that while medieval medicine was certainly based on the theory of humours, the idea that the body was made up of 4 fluids that needed to be in balance, it also included some surprisingly effective practices. Here's a quirky tidbit: medieval doctors, while often using bloodletting as a form of treatment, also used a wide range of herbal remedies and practiced surgery. They had a decent understanding of human anatomy. Thanks to earlier texts from ancient Greece and Rome, they would set broken bones, and even perform complex surgical procedures like removing a cataract or a bladder stone. And they had a surprisingly good understanding of the importance of cleanliness in healing. They would wash wounds with wine, which acted as an antiseptic, and they would often boil their instruments. It wasn't a sterile environment by any means, but it was a far cry from the complete ignorance we often imagine. Historians still argue whether the medical knowledge of the Middle Ages was a step back from the classical era, or if it was a period of slow, but steady, innovation. The reality is that for a lot of people, medicine was a mix of the spiritual and the practical. You would pray to a saint for healing, but you would also go to an herbalist for a remedy. It's a good reminder that even in the past, people were trying to find a way to get better, using all the tools at their disposal. As you continue to find your perfect, sleepy spot, let's turn our attention to one of the most common myths about medieval religious life: the idea that monasteries were an exclusively male domain. We picture these quiet, contemplative places as being filled with monks and friars, and we often forget about the other half of the religious world. The mainstream historical fact is that convents and nunneries were a key part of the religious landscape, and they offered a surprising amount of power and opportunity to women. Here's a quirky tidbit: being a nun wasn't just a spiritual path, it was often a way for women to escape a difficult marriage, or to get an education that would have been otherwise impossible to obtain. Convents were centres of learning, where women could read and write, and some nuns, like Hildegard of Bingen, became incredibly influential writers, composers, and theologians. A convent could be a place of quiet contemplation, but it could also be a hub of intellectual activity and political influence. Historians still argue whether the convent was a place of freedom for women, or if it was simply another way for a patriarchal society to control them. The reality is that for a lot of women, the convent was a genuine choice. It was a way to a life that had a certain amount of independence, a chance to have a voice and a degree of power that was often denied to them in secular society. So, while you might picture a medieval monastery as a place for men, remember that the convent was just as important and often a lot more interesting as you continue to find your perfect, sleepy spot. Let's turn our attention to one of the most common myths about medieval life: the idea of constant food shortages. We have this image of a time of perpetual famine, where everyone was constantly hungry, and the diet was incredibly limited and boring. The mainstream historical fact is that while famines certainly occurred, they were not the norm. For most of the Middle Ages, most people had a surprisingly diverse and abundant diet, especially when compared to later periods. Here's a quirky tidbit. The average peasant's diet was based on grains, but it also included a wide variety of vegetables, legumes, and even wild game. They would grow things like peas, beans, onions, and cabbage, and they would supplement their diet with things they foraged from the forest. They also drank a lot of ale and mead, which was a source of calories and was often safer to drink than the local water. And let's not forget the many feast days that were a part of medieval life, when even the poorest person would get to have a more celebratory meal. Historians still argue whether the famines that did occur were a sign of a flawed agricultural system, or if they were more a consequence of the unpredictable weather patterns of the time. The reality is that for a lot of people, life was a cycle of feast and famine. You had good years and bad years, and you had to be prepared for both. It's a good reminder that even in the past, people were more resilient and resourceful than we often give them credit for. They were just trying to get by, one meal at a time. Let's keep the slow drift going, because it's time to confront another one of the strangest and most persistent myths of the Middle Ages, the idea that the Pope banned cats during the medieval period. The myth is that the Catholic Church, seeing cats as a symbol of paganism and witchcraft, ordered their widespread slaughter, which in turn led to a massive increase in the rat population and helped spread the Black Death. It's a neat, tidy, and very compelling story. But the mainstream historical fact is that the myth that the Pope banned cats is a later misinterpretation of a papal bull from Pope Gregory IX. Here's a quirky tidbit. The papal bull, called Vox in Rama, was issued in 1233, and it wasn't about banning cats. It was actually a condemnation of a specific German heretical sect, the Luciferians. And it simply mentioned that they were believed to venerate a black cat. That's it. It wasn't a universal ban on all cats. In fact, cats were often seen as useful animals, prized for their ability to kill rats and other vermin. They were a common sight on farms and in cities. The idea that a single papal bull could have had such a devastating effect on the cat population is, frankly, a bit of a stretch. Historians still argue whether the misinterpretation of this papal bull was a deliberate attempt to discredit the church, or if it was just a simple misunderstanding that snowballed into a popular myth. The reality is that for most of the Middle Ages, cats were a common and often valued part of the household. So, while you might picture a medieval world without any feline friends, remember that the reality was a lot more normal and a lot less dramatic than the myth. As you continue to find your perfect, sleepy spot, let's turn our attention to one of the most visible and awe-inspiring parts of the Middle Ages, medieval architecture. We often have this idea of it being primitive, clumsy, and a bit clunky, especially when compared to the grand designs of the Romans. The myth is that it was a time of simple buildings and that a lot of the great cathedrals were just a happy accident of brute force and religious fervor. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval architecture was incredibly sophisticated, and it included some truly mind-boggling feats of engineering. Here's a quirky tidbit. The construction of a Gothic cathedral, for example, required an incredible amount of mathematical precision and engineering genius. They had to figure out how to distribute the weight of the massive stone roof down through the soaring arches and buttresses to the ground. They used a system of temporary wooden scaffolding and molds, and they had to be incredibly precise with their measurements. The use of the pointed arch and the flying buttress were not just for aesthetics. They were brilliant engineering solutions that allowed them to build higher and with more windows, creating the light-filled spaces that we still marvel at today. It's a bit like building a massive stone puzzle without a clear picture on the box. It takes a lot of skill and a lot of planning. Historians still argue whether the knowledge of this sophisticated engineering was a rediscovery of Roman techniques, or if it was a homegrown innovation born from a desire to build higher and more majestic churches. The reality is that the Middle Ages was a period of incredible innovation in the field of construction. They were pushing the boundaries of what was possible with stone and wood, and they were leaving a legacy of beautiful and lasting structures that we can still see today. So, while you might think of medieval people as being a bit backwards, remember that they were also master builders. Now, let's turn our attention to one of the most persistent myths that often gets painted with a very broad brush, the idea of a unidimensional, all-white population in the Middle Ages. The myth is that medieval Europe was a homogeneous, isolated place where everyone looked the same. The mainstream historical fact is that while less diverse than modern times, medieval Europe was far from a monolithic society. It had a surprising amount of contact and trade with cultures from all over the world. Here's a quirky tidbit. We have archaeological evidence and historical accounts of people of African and Middle Eastern descent living and working in medieval Europe. For example, there are historical records of merchants from North Africa and the Middle East traveling to and from European cities like Venice and Genoa. And let's not forget the long history of Moorish rule in Spain, which created a multicultural and multi-ethnic society that was a hub of intellectual and artistic exchange. There were also people of Jewish descent who lived in many parts of Europe, and while their lives were often difficult, they were a part of the medieval tapestry. Historians still argue whether these examples of diversity were the exception or if they were more a common part of the medieval landscape. But what we do know is that the idea of a completely isolated, all-white Europe is simply not accurate. People and ideas were moving around, and they were meeting people from different backgrounds. It's a good reminder that even in the past, the world was a lot more interconnected than we often think. As you continue to find your perfect, sleepy spot, let's turn our attention to one of the most iconic images of the medieval witch, a woman flying through the night sky on a broomstick. The myth is that this was a common belief, a symbol of the witch's power and her connection to the supernatural. But the mainstream historical fact is that the broomstick as a tool for flying is a myth that emerged much later, from folklore and art, and not from any genuine medieval belief. Here's a quirky tidbit. The broomstick was, of course, a common household item, and it had a certain phallic symbolism in later folklore, a kind of dark inversion of a knight's horse. It was also a symbol of domesticity. So to see a woman flying on one was a shocking reversal of a woman's traditional role. But in the Middle Ages, if you were accused of witchcraft, the main focus was on your supposed pact with the devil and your use of magic, not on your mode of transportation. The broomstick myth, in many ways, belongs to a later era of more formalized demonology and witch trials. Historians still argue whether the broomstick myth was a product of misogyny, a way to belittle and mock women who were accused of witchcraft, or if it was simply a symbol of a more wild and chaotic form of magic. The reality is that for a lot of people in the Middle Ages, the fear of witchcraft was a very real, very terrifying thing. But the details of how a witch operated were often a lot less dramatic than the later myths would have you believe. As you continue to find your perfect or sleepy spot, let's turn our attention to one of the most gruesome and often misunderstood methods of medieval punishment, burning at the stake. We have this image of it as a common form of execution, a punishment for all sorts of crimes, from murder to theft. The mainstream historical fact is that burning was not the only method of execution, and it was often reserved for very specific crimes, particularly heresy. Here's a quirky tidbit. The reason for burning a heretic was often rooted in the belief that fire would not only destroy the body but also purify the soul. It was a kind of spiritual cleansing, a final act of justice. For other crimes, like theft or murder, the more common forms of punishment were hanging or beheading. Burning was a very public and very dramatic form of execution, and it was used to send a very clear message about the dangers of challenging the church. It was a spectacle, and a brutal one at that, but it wasn't a punishment for just any crime. Historians still argue whether the burning of heretics was a sign of the church's deep-seated power, or if it was an act of desperation, a way to maintain control in a time of growing intellectual and religious dissent. The reality is that for a lot of people in the Middle Ages, the fear of heresy was a very real thing, and burning was a powerful symbol of the church's determination to stamp it out. It's a good reminder that even in the past, a form of punishment could be a political and religious statement, not just a way to deal with a crime. As you continue to find your perfect, sleepy spot, let's turn our attention to one of the most romanticized and often misunderstood figures of the Middle Ages, the troubadour. You have this image of a wandering minstrel, a commoner with a lute, who travels from town to town, singing songs of love and chivalry. The mainstream historical fact is that troubadours were not just wandering musicians, they were often highly educated poets and composers, and many of them were nobles themselves. Here's a quirky tidbit. The troubadour tradition originated in the south of France in the 11th century, and it was a form of lyric poetry that was often incredibly sophisticated and complex. The themes were often love and courtly romance, but they also included political commentary, satire, and even religious devotion, and the people who wrote and performed these songs were often members of the court. Some of the most famous troubadours were counts, dukes, and even a king or two. It was a popular pastime for the nobility, and it was a way for them to show off their wit and their intelligence. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a form of high art. Historians still argue whether the troubadours were a genuine form of artistic expression, or if their poetry was simply a way to justify the often brutal realities of courtly life. The reality is that for a lot of people, the troubadour was a respected artist, not just a wandering entertainer. It's a good reminder that even in the past, art and power were often intertwined, and that a song could be just as powerful as a sword. Let's keep our sleepy journey going, and turn our attention to another one of the most romanticized and often misunderstood figures of the medieval court, the jester. We have this image of a silly man in a motley suit, a fool with a bell-covered hat who is only there to provide light entertainment. The myth is that they were just a kind of medieval comedian. The mainstream historical fact is that jesters were not just entertainers, they were often highly intelligent and served as a kind of advisor and social commentator to the king. Here's a quirky tidbit. The jester's role was a unique one. Their position as a fool gave them a certain amount of license to say things that no one else could. They could mock the king, criticize the court, and make fun of powerful nobles, all under the guise of being a silly clown. This made them a valuable tool for a monarch who wanted to know what was really going on in their court. A jester could be a kind of truth-teller, a way for a king to get honest feedback in a world where everyone else was afraid to speak their mind, and a good jester could even influence policy by making a king or a noble look ridiculous. It wasn't always a joke. Sometimes it was a very serious political game. Historians still argue whether the jester's role was a genuine form of political satire, or if it was just a way for the powerful to blow off a little steam. The reality is that for a lot of people, the jester was a respected and powerful figure, not just a clown. It's a good reminder that even in the past, a little bit of humor could go a long way. Let's keep the slow drift going, because it's time to confront another one of the most common myths about medieval life, the idea of the medieval university as an exclusively male, cloistered, and purely theological institution. The myth is that these were places where only men studied to become priests, and that the curriculum was narrow and dogmatic. The mainstream historical fact is that while universities were certainly dominated by men, they were not all male, and they had a surprisingly diverse curriculum. Here's a quirky tidbit. While women were not allowed to be students in most universities, some, like the University of Bologna, had a surprisingly open-minded approach. We have historical records of women, like Battisia Gozzardini, who taught law there in the 13th century. It was an exception to the rule, to be sure, but it shows that the idea of a university as an exclusively male space was not a universal one. The curriculum itself was also a lot more varied than we often think. It wasn't just theology. Students would study subjects like law, medicine, and the liberal arts, which included things like grammar, logic, and rhetoric. It was a rigorous and well-rounded education for its time. Historians still argue whether the presence of women in some universities was a sign of a more progressive medieval society, or if it was simply a unique and isolated phenomenon. The reality is that for a lot of people, the university was a place of intellectual ferment, a place where new ideas were discussed and debated. It was a place where knowledge was not just preserved, but also created. It's a good reminder that even in the past, a place of learning could be more open and more intellectually curious than we often give it credit for, as you continue to find your perfect, sleepy spot. Let's turn our attention to one of the most iconic and often misunderstood elements of chivalry, the heroic duel. We have this idea of it as a romantic and honourable way to settle a dispute, a test of skill and bravery between two knights. The myth is that these duels were always about honour and were fought in a gentlemanly fashion. The mainstream historical fact is that while duels did occur, they were often a tool for settling legal disputes, and they were far from a romantic affair. Here's a quirky tidbit. The duel, or trial by combat, was a real legal procedure in the Middle Ages. The idea was that God would grant victory to the person who was in the right. It wasn't always a dramatic affair between two equals, either. If you were a peasant, you might have to fight a noble, and the odds were stacked against you. In some cases, you could even hire a champion to fight for you. It was a brutal and often very messy way to get justice. Historians still argue whether the trial by combat was a genuine expression of faith or if it was simply a way to get out of a difficult legal case. The reality is that for a lot of people, a duel was a terrifying last resort, not a romantic ideal. It's a good reminder that even in the past, a legal battle could be a matter of life and death. Let's keep the gentle flow going and turn our attention to one of the most romanticized and often misunderstood parts of medieval warfare, the knight's horse. We have this image of it as a massive, heavy, and clumsy beast. The kind of horse you see in fantasy movies, with a huge frame that can carry a knight in full armor and a full array of weapons. The myth is that these were simply gigantic, plodding animals. But the mainstream historical fact is that war horses were not the massive, clumsy beasts of modern fantasy. They were smaller, agile, and incredibly valuable mounts. Here's a quirky tidbit. The war horse, or destrier, was a carefully bred and highly trained animal, but it was not the massive Clydesdale we often imagine. They were more like a modern quarter horse, muscular and strong, but also very fast and agile. They had to be, in order to maneuver on a battlefield. And they weren't just a mount, they were a weapon. A knight's horse could be trained to kick and bite at the enemy, and it was a crucial part of a knight's fighting style. And remember, a war horse was a huge investment. A good one could cost as much as a small fortune, and a knight would often have a team of people just to care for his horse. Historians still argue whether the destrier was a unique breed, or if it was simply a well-trained version of a more common horse. The reality is that for a lot of people, the knight's horse was a respected and powerful animal, a symbol of a knight's wealth and status. It's a good reminder that even in the past, a horse could be a lot more than just a ride, as you continue to find your perfect sleepy spot. Let's turn our attention to one of the most persistent myths about the lowest social class in the Middle Ages, the peasant's lot. We have this image of a life of constant grim suffering, where a peasant was a poor, dirty, and perpetually miserable serf, a kind of human-shaped piece of property. The myth is that peasant life was just a grim existence of toil and oppression. The mainstream historical fact is that while peasant life was certainly tough, it wasn't just a grim existence of constant suffering and toil. Here's a quirky tidbit. A peasant's life was dictated by the seasons and the agricultural calendar, but it also included a surprising amount of community, celebration, and even leisure. There were feast days, religious holidays, and local festivals that were a key part of their lives. A peasant's day wasn't just about tilling the soil. They had their own social life, their own families, and their own small pleasures. And while they were tied to the land and had obligations to their lord, they weren't necessarily slaves. They had certain rights, and in some cases, they could even take a lord to court if he was being unfair. Historians still argue whether the peasants' relationship with their lord was more of a partnership or a form of exploitation. The reality is that for a lot of people, peasant life was a mix of hard work and community. It was a life that was often difficult and uncertain, but it was also a life that had its own rhythms and its own joys. It's a good reminder that even in the past, people were more complex than our simple historical myths allow, as you continue to find your perfect, sleepy spot. Let's turn our attention to one of the most persistent myths about medieval architecture and life, the idea of the isolated castle. We have this image of a lonely, solitary fortress, a remote and self-sufficient home for a lord and his small retinue. The myth is that these were just military outposts, cut off from the rest of the world. The mainstream historical fact is that castles were not isolated fortresses. They were bustling centres of economic and social activity. Here's a quirky tidbit. A castle was more than just a home for a noble. It was the heart of a large estate, and it was a hub for all sorts of people. There would have been a large number of servants, craftsmen, and soldiers living in and around the castle walls. It was a place of work, of trade, and of governance. A lord would hold court in his castle, he would receive visitors, and he would oversee the management of his lands. The castle was a nerve centre, a place where people came to resolve disputes, to pay their taxes, and to conduct business. It wasn't an isolated place, it was the hub of a community. Historians still argue whether the primary function of a castle was military or residential. The reality is that it was both. A castle had to be a defensible fortress, but it also had to be a comfortable and functional home for a lord and his family. It's a good reminder that even in the past, a building could serve multiple purposes, and that a home was often a place of business and a centre of power. As you continue to find your perfect, sleepy spot, Let's turn our attention to one of the most beloved and often repeated tales of the Middle Ages, the story of Saint George and the Dragon. You've probably heard it before: a brave knight, a fearsome beast, and a beautiful princess who needs saving. It's a perfect tale of heroism and good triumphing over evil. The mainstream historical fact is that the story of Saint George and the Dragon is a later, allegorical tale, not a historical event. Here's a quirky tidbit. Saint George was a real person, a soldier in the Roman army who was martyred in the 4th century. The legend of him slaying a dragon, however, only emerged centuries later, in the 11th century. The dragon was a symbol of paganism, and the princess was a symbol of the church. So, the story was not a historical event. It was a powerful religious and moral allegory, a way to teach a lesson about faith and courage. It was a story that was so compelling that it eventually took on a life of its own, and people began to believe that it was a literal, historical event. Historians still argue whether the story was a deliberate piece of propaganda created by the church, or if it was simply a folk tale that evolved over time. The reality is that for a lot of people, the story of Saint George and the Dragon was a source of inspiration and a reminder of the power of faith. It was a story that was more about what people believed than about what actually happened. It's a good reminder that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that are not true at all. As you continue to find your perfect sleepy spot, let's turn our attention to one of the most beloved and persistent legends of all time, the story of King Arthur. We have this image of a heroic king, a noble warrior, and a legendary figure who ruled over a kingdom of peace and justice. The myth is that he was a real, historical monarch, the one true King of England. The mainstream historical fact is that King Arthur is likely a mythological figure, not a real historical monarch. Here's a quirky tidbit. The earliest mentions of a figure named Arthur come from Welsh and Latin texts from centuries after his supposed lifetime. These texts describe him as a great warrior who led the Britons against the Saxon invaders, but they don't give a lot of historical detail. The story of the Round Table, Camelot, and all the familiar trappings of the legend were added much later, in the 12th century, by a writer named Geoffrey of Monmouth, who was writing a fictional history of the kings of Britain. It was a smashing success, and it cemented the legend of King Arthur in the popular imagination. Historians still argue whether there was a real-life warrior who inspired the legend of King Arthur, a kind of historical kernel that the myth grew around. The reality is that, for a lot of people, the story of King Arthur was a source of national pride, a way to create a heroic past for a country that was often in a state of turmoil. It was a story that was more about what people wanted to believe than about what actually happened. And so, we come to the end of our little journey, a journey through a world of half-truths and tall tales, a journey that has hopefully shown you that history is a lot more complex, a lot more human, and a lot more interesting than the simple myths we create to make sense of it. It's a world that was both beautiful and brutal, but it was always a world of real people, just like you and me. And as you feel the last vestiges of your waking mind begin to fade, let's just hold on to that thought for a moment. The darkness is settling in now, wrapping you in its comforting embrace. The weight of the world, and all its messy history, is slowly lifting from your shoulders. All the knights, the popes, the plague doctors, and the kings are now just ghosts in the machine, whispering in the quiet halls of your mind. You can let them go. There's no need to hold on to them. It's time to just breathe, deep in and slow out. All the stories, all the facts, all the debates, they can wait for tomorrow. The only thing that matters now is the gentle rhythm of your own breath, the soft hum of the fan, and the quiet comfort of your bed. The journey is over. For now, there's nothing left to do but let yourself float, let yourself drift, let yourself be carried away into the gentle, silent sea of sleep. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.